Good morning and welcome back to Spiritwind. And as you remember, Spiritwind is a study group for spiritual adventurers. And this is a group of us that meets every Wednesday at 5:30 at Unity of Auburn. Each month we have a different subject matter. And this past month we were talking about the Muslim Jesus. So we'd like to recap that a little bit before we go into our new subject matter for October. And I'd like to introduce our teacher, our author, our leader, Rick Reich. And he will help us to figure out what Muslim Jesus is all about. So can you summarize a little bit what we learned about the Quran?
Yes, in the Quran, Jesus, he's called Isa in Arabic, and his mother Mary is referred to as Maryam, but that is Jesus and Mary. And the Quran mentions Jesus by name 25 times, while it mentions Muhammad by name only 4 times. However, it also refers to Jesus as the son of Mary, the Messiah, the prophet, and the apostle. And likewise, it refers to Muhammad many times as the prophet and the apostle.
And so where did you get a lot of the information for what you're helping us to learn?
Well, I had a book that I read from. It's called The Muslim Jesus. I don't know if you can see that well, but it's Muslim Jesus, and it's what it is it's a genre of tales of the prophet, and Al-Ghazali wrote the most, who lived in 1111. And the greatest number of stories in these tales of the prophets are of Jesus and or Mary, and that's about all with the sources.
Okay, so you have Al-Ghazali, who wrote that, and then I think you've mentioned Rumi before,
yes.
And then I've heard of Hafiz too. Did he write about Jesus?
Yes, and actually Hafiz was not his real name. His name was Khaja Shams ad-Din Muhammad. And Hafiz, that's how he's commonly known as. And Hafiz was actually a title they gave to a person that had memorized the Quran. So Hafiz had memorized the Quran. Here's just a few of things he wrote. And if the grace of the Holy Spirit guides us once more, others would also perform what Jesus did. And then he wrote, I am a flute. I am a hole in a flute that Christ's breath moves through. Listen to this music. And then this particular one, he even speaks about Christians and Jews and other things. He says, I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, or an angel, or even a pure soul. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known.
So it sounds like Hafiz was probably pretty popular back then, but is he popular today?
Okay, Hafiz was very popular in Persia, where he was from, and he still is the most popular one there. But he has become very popular as well in the United States and Europe as well, and there are many books published of his poetry.
And do we have other quotations from other prophets or other books?
Yes. In fact, Hafiz's teacher Attar wrote, some Israels insulted Jesus one day as he walked through the marketplace. He answered them only by repeating prayers in their names. Someone said to him, you prayed for these men. Do you not feel anger at their treatment of you? He answered, I could spend only what I carry in my purse.
Oh, if he didn't have hate in his purse, he couldn't spend it.
Right.
Okay.
So
Right.
I'm going to read a couple others from the book, The Muslim Jesus,
Okay.
just to give you an idea how they wrote. And they wrote these gospel statements as if they were really writing the Gospels. I mean, they believed that they were inspired to say what they were saying, and they believed that what they said was true about Jesus. This one said, Jesus used to say, truly I say to you, to eat wheat bread, to drink pure water, and sleep upon dunghills with dogs more than suffice him who wishes to inherit paradise. Now that sounds like a strange quote, but the interesting thing is the notes that go along with the quotation say that among modern educated Muslims, this is the most known saying. And, you know, we can understand the first part where it says eating bread and pure water, but sleeping on dung heaps with the dog sounds horrible, but that was an example of asceticism, which the Sufis practiced, denying the flesh and so forth. One other quote I wanted to read was, and I just love this, Jesus passed by a cow which was calving and was in great distress. O Word of God, said the cow, pray that God will deliver me. And it said Jesus is referring to like how animals talk in the Bible. We have the serpent that talked. There was Balaam's donkey that talked to him. And here they have a cow talking to Jesus. And being a healer, Jesus is able to heal the cow in terms of making it deliver its calf gently.
So we see throughout the literature that Jesus is mentioned,
Right.
both in the Quran and in the writings about the Quran
Right.
from other writers and prophets
Right.
and so forth.
Yeah.
So even though they don't use the word Jesus, they use the word Isa for Jesus.
I, as a matter of fact, was talking to a Muslim, and I was telling them I was teaching a class on the Muslim Jesus, and they said, there's no Muslim Jesus. I said, sure is. God, he's mentioned all through the Quran. And the person said, no, he isn't. I've never seen the name of Jesus in the Quran. The problem is because they refer to Jesus as Isa. You know, and that's the deal.
Right. Well, that it makes it clear for us then. Thank you very much. All right. So now in October, we're going to have a different subject, and that's going to be the forgotten witches of ancient Israel. And you've actually written a book about this, haven't you?
Yeah, this is it. It's called The Forgotten Witches of Ancient Israel.
And I notice on your book you have as your name Rick Kuykendall.
Right.
And we always refer to you as Rick Reich. And I just thought maybe you want to clear that up a little bit for people.
Rick Reich is my legal name, but my pen name is Kuykendall because that was my birth name. I took my wife's maiden name as my last name when we got married.
Well, I guess that clears that up.
Mhm.
So what even got you interested in writing a book about witches of ancient Israel?
Well, what came to me is one day I was reading the Bible. I'd probably read this passage 100 times and just it didn't click. But it says in Exodus 22:18, it says, "Thou shalt not allow a witch to live." And suddenly it struck me that in the past, all these witch burnings that happened in the Middle Ages were based on that text. And even more than that, since that statement was said back in the statement of Moses, it suggested that there must have been witches back then. Because Exodus 22:18 wasn't written in the Middle Ages for the witches they were burning then. It was for what was happening in Israel at that time. So I decided to reread the Bible, looking for other clues that I could find which said what the witches were like in Bible times. What they did, what they considered, why they were considered so bad or evil, and so bad that they had a death penalty hanging over them. And what for? Just for practicing a religion that was different than the Jews.
So will you be talking about witches in the Middle Ages also then in your book or in our class?
In our class and in the book, it's kind of divided into three parts. First is looking at the way witches are referred to in Bible times. Then I deal with how the witches were dealt with and what they were up to in medieval times. And then the third part, I look at what witchcraft is today.
Oh, okay.
And how are they similar or different, all three of them.
So when you're looking at passages in the Bible and doing your research, what other things did you find?
Well, first I looked up the word witch, witches, and witchcraft as they're used in the Bible. Then I looked into the original Hebrew and Greek for the related terms for witch in the original language to see what I could find out about them.
And what did you find out?
I found that something interesting has happened in recent times. If you look in the King James Bible or any Bibles, I'd say before the 20th century, all through the Bible, there are statements about witches and witchcraft. But if you pick up a modern Bible, for instance, the New Revised Standard Version, which is, an important version of the Bible, witch is never even used. Witchcraft, none of it's even used.
So what do they say?
Well, they say that everywhere that it says witches or witchcraft, it says sorcery, sorcerers or sorcery, and that sort of thing. And so when you look at Exodus 22:18, which reads, "Thou shalt not suffer or allow a witch to live," when you look at the same verse in the New Revised Standard, it says, "You shall not permit a female sorcerer to live."
It's okay if a male sorcerer.
Well, again, they think of witches as being women.
Females, yeah.
And so they don't even say witch. They say a sorcerer instead. And in my view, I think that I read all the introductions to the Revised Standard Version to see if there was somewhere they would say why they changed that. Never did they ever say why. So I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, but I'm assuming that they made the change out of political correctness. because nowadays people that know the Bible know that, like, the witches that were burnt in medieval times had nothing to do with the witches in Bible times. They didn't do the same things. They weren't accused of the same things. It was totally different. Plus, there was just a bad thing that goes around with witches. A lot of people think witches are a form of Satanism, which witches have nothing to do with Satanism, and in fact, they don't even believe in Satan.
Well, the Bible times, Israelites must have seen some of these people as doing something wrong. So what were these sorcerer witches doing that the Israelites didn't like?
Well, what they were doing back then is it says in the Bible that these women were worshiping on every high hill and under every shaded tree, and so they didn't have places of worships like some of the other religions,
like a church or
right, like if you went to, for instance, the Temple of Dagon. Dagon was a god back then, and he had a temple. But these people had no temple, no building whatsoever. It was all outdoors. And the things they did that were seen as contrary to the Torah were they did divination, usually by reading the entrails of animals. They practiced astrology, not like we do today, because they thought the stars were gods and goddesses. And so they worshiped the heavenly bodies, the stars and that, and of course that was forbidden by Judaism. And so because of these things of worshiping the stars and all that, the sun and the moon and the stars, and practicing divination. In fact, there's one of the most famous stories about witches in the Bible. It's a story called the Witch of Endor, and the story is that King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, had betrayed God and not done what God had wanted him to do, which was kill everything breathing of the Amalekites, to commit complete genocide. And so he was going to have to fight him, and he didn't do it the way God said. And so Saul found himself in a place where the prophet Samuel, who used to confer with him, had died, and God was no longer speaking to him. He felt that God had cut him off because of his disobedience. And so what ended up happening, see, witches were illegal. You were put to death. He actually went to a witch, who's called the Witch of Endor, in a disguise, because he thought if the woman knew who he was, she wouldn't do it because it's a death penalty. So he came in a disguise and he says, "Can you raise Samuel for me? I need to talk to him." And she pled with him because she figured out who it was, and she said, "Don't do anything to me if I do this." And he didn't. And he raised Samuel, and supposedly what Samuel said was that this next battle that he was going to fight, he would die in and lose. And of course that's exactly what happened. Then if you skip to what I call the burning times, and a lot of people call the burning times, that's in the Middle Ages. That went from, it's hard to believe, it went from the mid 1400s all the way to 1793, when the last witch was executed in Europe. 1793. And when did we become a nation?
1776?
Yeah, so this is even years after that. they still were executing witches, even when we were becoming a nation. Anyway, and then skipping to the last, the modern expressions of witchcraft. While there are a few things written about witchcraft in the late 1800s and early 1900s, writings started to appear about witchcraft, different people writing. And,
people who were practicing witchcraft were writing these things?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But it wasn't until 1951, if you can imagine that the law against witchcraft was finally lifted.
By who?
Well, this was the English government.
Okay, but how about the Catholic Church? Because it seems like they were the main protagonists.
Yeah, well, to this day, the Catholic Church is against it. They just can't execute anyone anymore, so instead they can condemn them to the fires of hell, or if they were good people, at least to purgatory or something like that. But in 1951, when the law was repealed, there was a gentleman by the name of Gerald Gardner, and he said that he had come upon a coven of witches in England there, near where he lived, and they had initiated him into their circle, their coven. And so in 1954, he wrote the book Witchcraft Today. And that was a big one because it was the first real modern statement of witchcraft and what it is today. And as a matter of fact, it was Gardner who gave the term Wicca to modern witches rather than witch. And the reason why he was doing it was twofold. One, you say witch, you're going to get a bad reaction just because of the stereotypes and everything. The other reason is that the word Wicca was actually an old English word for witch. It was the old English word for witch. And so he was trying to differentiate between, he was differentiating from what they called dark witches and white witches and all that sort of thing. And and it's interesting now, this theologian by the name of Diana Butler Bass, in her book Christianity After Religion, she shows in her book that she evaluates the different denominations today and different religions today and their growth rate. Christianity's lagging way behind. Muslims and Buddhists are growing. But, she says, the fastest growing religion in the United States is Wicca. And she gives statistics to prove it.
And does she just say in the United States, or is it kind of catching on in other areas too?
It's in Europe and Australia as well.
Oh.
And the strange thing about modern Wicca or witchcraft, it's a grassroots kind of thing, other than like I said, with the ones in biblical times, they met on hilltops. They didn't have churches or buildings, and neither do modern ones either. And it's been fascinating because I've attended some gatherings, large gatherings of Wiccan people that from all different groups and all different areas that come together. And the strange thing is, even though these people have maybe never communicated with each other, when they start to do ritual, everyone knows exactly what to do. They don't have to read a book or anything. They just know what to do. And that's just how it is.
Oh. Well, that sounds like it's pretty interesting, and I think that we'll get into it more during the class.
Oh yeah, there's a lot more to say. Yeah.
And did you want to say that you actually practice some Wicca?
Yeah, what happened was, after I finished seminary and so forth, I was in the ministry for a few years, and I ended up at my father-in-law's house one time, and he had a huge library. And in that library were the books Witchcraft Today, those same books by Gerald Gardner, those two books I mentioned earlier. So I read them as a Christian minister. And when I read them, I saw that there was really nothing that was in contradiction to what I practice as a Christian. I didn't see any conflict between the two. And so I was actually a member of a coven for some 10 years in Southern California before I moved up to Auburn. I haven't been involved since I've been here, except on just a few occasions.
Well, again, we'll be discussing this and more at our Wednesday meetings that we have at 5:30 at Unity of Auburn, which is at 1212 High Street. And we invite everyone to come. This is open to everyone. It's not church related, it's Spiritwind related. And we hope to see you there. Thank you again, Rick.
Thank you.